Do you think the Third Amendment doesn't matter? You better think again. Most people know that the Third Amendment bans forcing citizens to quarter soldiers, but is that all there is to it? Why did the founders believe it was so crucial that they wrote it into the Bill of Rights? While it may seem outdated, could it still have real implications today? Hey y'all, and welcome back to the podcast. This is Voices of Liberty, and I am your host, Isabel, and I just want to say that I am so thankful for every single one of my listeners. I'm so glad y'all have chosen to listen to my podcast. For those of you who are new, we are breaking down the Bill of Rights. So far, we have gone through the First and Second Amendments within the Bill of Rights. So before we really begin to break down the third, I always want to do a refresher because there is a lot that goes into each amendment and kind of just what they mean. So before I do that, though, I want to go through the verse of the week. And the verse of the week this week is, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." Matthew 17:20. The weekly challenge this week is to just take a rest day. I actually did this yesterday because I was so overwhelmed with everything going on with the podcast, CCW content, and I just needed time to myself. So me and my grandma, we went to town. We just kind of did some errands. We went to Chick-fil-A. We just had a blast. And I came home and I went fishing. I went kayaking and fishing at the same time. I actually caught a really big fish and then it broke the hook after I got it almost to the kayak. So love that. But I did catch a few more fish and it was just really, really fun. And I was able to watch the sunset and just pray and really just refresh myself in the Lord and I was just really able to bask in the Lord's beauty and all the things he has given us and just pray about some things on my heart. So I was just really, really appreciative of that time, and it really did good for my mental health to take a day to just rest. And it doesn't even have to be a whole day. Maybe it's just an hour. Maybe it's just a few minutes. So I highly recommend that you take a day for yourself. I know a lot of you are moms out there, and I just really, really think it would be beneficial if you took a day to rest. It could be maybe going to dinner with your husband, maybe watching a movie at home. For me and my husband, sometimes we'll create a pallet on the floor and we'll just watch a movie. I know it's something that little kids do, but we literally just love it. And it's just such a great time to just rest and be together. So those are just some ideas I'll throw at you. But I'm telling you, I took some time for myself yesterday and I came back to the podcast, came back to the content, and I was so refreshed. My mind was open and I was just ready to work. So I highly recommend it. It's really, really good for you. And I don't think the Lord wants us to work nonstop. I think he does want us to take some time to rest and just bask in his glory and his beauty. I am so grateful that y'all have decided to listen to this podcast. We have gone through the First and Second Amendments within the Bill of Rights, and it has taken a while to get through them. There is so much to unpack in every single amendment that we've had to do it in more than just one episode, especially the First Amendment, because there's so much. It has truly just been so rewarding, though, to unpack them all and unpack them slowly, because it has taught me so much, and I know it's taught y'all a lot. So this is really why I started it, is just so we can learn together. I want to go ahead and refresh our memory. This is something I do every time when opening up the podcast, because there's just a lot in there, and it's nice to have a refresher. So in the second episode, we went through the First Amendment, and it says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Now, this is one of the most important amendments to me because there's just so much that goes into this. Remember, the First Amendment deals with freedom of religion, the press, speech, the right to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government. This is an important amendment, and it has a huge impact on Americans. This is probably, if you don't remember any of the other ones, I do want y'all to remember this one because I gave y'all a bunch of court cases and examples of when the government has infringed on these rights. And if we aren't aware and know our rights as Americans, the government can take control and we won't know, and we'll just sit idly by and let them do it. So we have to really, really be aware of what's going on around us. We have to know our rights as Americans. The Second Amendment is obviously a more popular one, and it says, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." So the Second Amendment deals with our right to own firearms and other weapons. We learned that even though it is a right, there are regulations that shape this right, similar to freedom of speech. You can't say whatever you want and there not be consequences. We talked about that in the second episode. Now we're going to be going through the Third Amendment, and this one's not as common. I actually did an Instagram poll to see, and I did one on Facebook too in the Facebook group, but I did a poll to see who all knew the Third Amendment, and this is the results. So it was 51% of you knew it, and 49% of you didn't. So it was almost split in half, which is pretty interesting to me. So if you are listening to this podcast right now and you don't know the Third Amendment, that is completely okay. I didn't know it for the longest time, and you really just have to learn and really just do your own research. But it is important that we do know it, because if not, the government will infringe on those rights. So we have to be very, very knowledgeable on these things, and I'm going to give you an example of a court case of when this actually happened. And my husband, he edits my podcast episodes just to make sure all the information's correct. And he didn't even know about this court case. He was like, this is crazy. This is crazy that this happened. Like, this is insane. And if you don't know, he's going to law school. So I'm going to be talking about that court case towards the end of this podcast episode. But I really want y'all to pay attention, because this could very easily happen to any of us. And if we're not careful, we just have to know these things. Like, we have to know our rights as Americans, because if not, the government can take over. So with all of that said, here is the Third Amendment. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by the law. So you may be thinking, what the heck does that even mean? Don't worry, we're going to dive in. So I want to go over kind of the history and the background of this. So before the American Revolutions, British soldiers could literally just barge into American colonist homes and demand to stay. This was typically done if the barracks were full and they needed a place to stay. And the sad part is the colonists couldn't do anything about it. They had to let them in. They had to house them, feed them, and allow them to stay until the soldiers were just ready to leave. This was actually not permitted in England, but it was allowed in America. Back in England, there were laws that prevented soldiers from demanding stay in citizens' homes. I want to read this part in the English Bill of Rights about quartering soldiers. So we kind of talked about this in the last episode, but there is a Bill of Rights that England has, and this is kind of what James Madison also based some of his ideas on for the American Bill of Rights. I also want to point out that the English Bill of Rights was written in 1689, but it talks about the quartering of soldiers, and this is what it says. By raising and keeping a standing army within this kingdom in time of peace without consent of Parliament, and quartering soldiers contrary to the law. So it's basically saying quartering of soldiers not allowed. Okay, y'all, let me tell you about my friends at 7 Weeks Coffee. 7 Weeks Coffee is America's pro-life coffee company on a mission to fund the pro-life movement one cup of coffee at a time. Why are they called 7 Weeks Coffee? Because at 7 weeks, a baby is the size of a little coffee bean, and it's the same time a heartbeat is clearly detected on an ultrasound. That is why they donate 10% of every sale to support pregnancy care centers across the country. They have raised over $800,000 for these centers and have saved thousands of lives. Now, let me tell you about the coffee, because I am very picky about what I put into my body. It's mold-free, pesticide-free, shade-grown, and low-acid, and it's organically farmed. It truly checks all the boxes. So go to 7weekscoffee.com and save 15% forever when you subscribe. Plus, exclusively for my listeners, use the code OFFICIALCCW for an extra 10% off your first order. That's a 25% total savings on your first order. Remember, your order will directly help support a network of over 1,000 pro-life organizations across the U.S. However, the same law did not apply to the American colonists, which I think is kind of funny that they didn't allow it in England, but they allowed it to happen here and kind of pushed for it to happen in America. So obviously, this was allowed in America, and Britain took advantage of this. The Quartering Act of 1764 was passed, and this act allowed soldiers to be housed in private homes. So there was a Quartering Act passed in 1764, and this applied to the American colonies. This happened during the French Indian War, which was from 1754 to 1763. During the French Indian War, Britain needed a way to house their soldiers, and they would just force colonists to open their homes and make room for the soldier to live there, which I think is absolutely insane. I can imagine being a mother and just being at home with my children, and then all of a sudden some soldier just barges in and he's like, hey, I demand to stay here, and you have to feed me, and you have to do X, Y, Z. That would be absolutely not. I would not want that. This was mainly done when there were no more barracks or room for the soldiers. So there were barracks and things like that for them, but they obviously got full at times and they needed a place to house them. These colonists were now responsible for paying for the soldiers' food and care, which I think is absolutely absurd. In 1765, Parliament passed an amendment to the Mutiny Act called the Quartering Act of 1765. For those who don't know, the Mutiny Acts were laws passed that basically dealt with the British armies. And then, obviously, Parliament passed the Quartering Act of 1765. And this basically just made the colonial citizens responsible for paying for soldiers' food and stay. Technically, if the colonists didn't want to house the soldiers in their private homes, they would have to pay for their stay in an inn or some other place, which is, again, crazy. This act basically just made it where if there was no room in the barracks, the British Army could take public businesses and buildings over and house the soldiers there. If the colonists did not want them housed there, they had to pay, obviously, for the soldiers' in stay. I just want y'all to imagine having to give up your home or business to allow a soldier to stay there. Just imagine it for a second. On top of all this, you are also responsible for paying for their food. This was a huge infringement on the colonists' rights, and they were really upset about it, understandably so. I wanted to give an example of this happening before the American Revolution, and this is kind of what led to the American Revolution. It played a part in it, per se. I want you guys listening to have an understanding of what was actually going on and how it affected the colonists. Again, I just want to say, if the barracks were full, they would force colonists under the Quartering Act of 1765 to house British soldiers in their businesses or public buildings. Colonists were responsible for paying for the housing of these men if they had to stay in inns, and they were also responsible for paying for their food. So in the town of Boston, there were residents living in the manufactory house. For those who don't know, the manufactory house is a place that was just built for women and young girls to work. The focus of the business was making linens and things like that. However, the business wasn't doing that great, and the manufactory house was just instead used to house residents. Most of the residents were poor people. They were people who were sick, poor, or homeless. These are the people who were living in the manufactory house. And I do want to point out that there were some people still working and weaving linens in the basement, but the majority of the people in the manufacturing house were needy people. The date was October 20th, 1768, before the American Revolution. There was a man named William Greenleaf who was a sheriff in the town of Boston. He and a few other men got together and they went to the manufacturing house with every intention of kicking out the residents, as he wanted to turn it into barracks for the British soldiers. He was planning to force everyone out, leaving them homeless. Can you imagine that? Already not having hardly anything. You're very, very poor. You might have even been homeless before living at the manufacturing house. And Sheriff Greenleaf just decides, I'm going to come in here and kick everyone out because we need room for our soldiers. When Sheriff Greenleaf arrived, the residents were waiting for them and captured them all. The residents knew what he was planning and had had enough. However, when they captured him, he cried out for the British soldiers to come to his aid. Of course. It wasn't long until the British soldiers arrived and the soldiers had the manufacturing house surrounded. William Greenleaf was let go, but the soldiers remained. The residents were fearful, but eventually the British soldiers left as they were called to other duties. So I just want to point out that this is an event that played a huge role in leading up to the American Revolution. We know of the commonly taught events like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, but there were events like this that played a huge role into the buildup of the American Revolution. And it isn't talked about enough, but this was a particular situation when the residents stood up for themselves and fought back. And I really, really admire that. This was also in Boston, if you're wondering. Boston, everything is going on in Boston, y'all. But there is a lot that we can say about the scenario. If the residents had given in, they would have lost literally everything. Because they rebelled and stood their ground, they were eventually left alone. And I wanted to read a section from this article, and it's just going over the situation again and kind of just describing it in more detail. But it's from the bostonbook.org, and it says, on October 19th, the sheriff, lieutenant governor, and the chief of justice arrived at the manufacturing house to evict the tenants. Although weaving still took place in the building's basement, by this time the manufacturing house was chiefly housing a site for Boston's neediest. The residents, having secured the building's doors and windows, refused to vacate the premises. Eventually, a crowd hostile to the eviction formed outside, and the British troops were called in. With a tense standoff ensuing and the possibility of violence erupting, Governor Bernard ordered the withdrawal of the troops. So actually, the governor withdrew the troops. Although a relatively brief event, the standoff in the manufacturing house was highly significant as an act of resistance to Bostonians to arm British troops. So that was an article from the Boston Books. And basically, when the founders were framing and forming our nation, they remembered Americans' distaste for the quartering of soldiers, and they wanted to protect the rights of Americans. While this is not really an issue today, there has been one court case that I want to mention that specifically deals with the Third Amendment. So this court case is called the Engblom v. Carey case, and there is a lot that goes into this court case. So I'm going to try to explain it to you all and give like a little recap at the end. But I'm going to read the facts of the case from studicata.com. I could be saying that wrong. But it says, in Engblom v. Carey, plaintiffs Maureen E. Engblom and Charles E. Palmer, who were corrections officer at the Mid-Orange Correctional Facility, brought a lawsuit against the governor of New York and various state prison officials. The officers claimed that their rights under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment and the Third Amendment were violated when they were evicted from their facility residences during a strike in April and May of 1979. The residences were subsequently used to house members of the National Guard without their consent and without prior notice or hearing. The defendants moved for summary judgment, which was initially granted based on the belief that the plaintiffs lacked sufficient possessory interests in their residences. However, the Second Circuit affirmed the dismissal of the due process claim, while reversing the dismissal of the Third Amendment claim, stating that the nature of the plaintiff's property interest needed further examination. Upon remand, the defendants continued to assert that they were entitled to qualified immunity. The case proceeded to this summary judgment motion, which ultimately led to the dismissal of the plaintiff's claims against the defendants. So there's a lot in the facts of the case. I'm going to break it down real quick where we can understand it. I just want to say that if you are a little put off by this because there's so much information, that's completely normal. I had to read this about 6 or 7 times before I was able to get an idea of what happened. And then my husband had to explain it to me and just kind of give me a recap again because he does read court cases all the time. And so I was able to really just understand it after that point. But it's okay if you don't understand it all right now, is what I'm trying to say. So essentially, there were these corrections officers, and they were at the Mid-Orange Correctional Facility in New York. Well, there was a strike going on, and the governor called in the National Guard to get everything under control. But what happened was the National Guard basically kicked these corrections officers out of their homes. That was, I guess, on the property of the prison. These people, I also want to say, these people didn't own these homes. They were just tenants. They just rented it. But the National Guard basically kicked them out and started staying there. So those are just kind of the facts. I want to read another article that's a little bit more detailed again from opencasebook.org. And it says, on April 18th, 1979, a statewide strike was called by the security and law enforcement employees of Council 82. On that day, Governor Hugh L. Carey issued a proclamation and executive order activating the National Guard. On April 19th, most of the officers at Mid-Orange joined the strike. Either that day or the following day, Superintendent Snow because of the strike, issued an order barring striking employees from the facility grounds unless they obtained his permission. At 12:10 a.m. on April 21st, snow finally declared an emergency at Mid-Orange. Beginning around April 19th, National Guardsmen had begun arriving at Mid-Orange, eventually reaching a maximum force of 260. As a result of these developments, from April 19th to April 25th, appellants and other employees believed to be on strike were repeatedly denied access to the administration building. Striking officers who lived in staff housing were thus also denied access to their apartments, with one exception on April 20th, when an appellant, Igblom, was permitted to retrieve some personal items. The payroll rental deductions were canceled effective April 19th, 1979. Sometime before April 25th, a decision was made by Mid-Orange to clear the rooms that had been leased to the striking officers so that the rooms could be used to house National Guardsmen, who, until then, had been housed in the school administration buildings. On April 25th, officer tenants were permitted to enter and remove and store their belongings in a locked storage area in the building, and appellants did so. The rooms had been ransacked, personal property was found to be missing or destroyed. Beginning at the same time, the guardsmen were housed in these rooms and remained until the end of the strike on May 5th. It is undisputed that Palmer's room was so used. While Snow's affidavit states that Ingblom's room was never occupied by guardsmen, this was disputed by Ingblom's affidavit. When the strike was over on May 5th, appellants were made an offer to resume residence in their staff housing, which they declined. Neither was terminated, and both continued to work as corrections officers at Mid-Orange. So those are the more detailed facts of this case. And there's a lot that goes into that. So I want to point out that this is the only case where the Third Amendment has been challenged. To just give a little recap, essentially what happened in this case was there was 2 jail corrections officers who filed a lawsuit against the governor of New York. There was a strike, and the governor of New York declared a national emergency and brought the National Guard in to get it under control. There were places to stay on the property for the corrections officers, and they were evicted from their homes once the National Guard arrived. So these corrections officers lived on site at this prison, and they were basically not allowed to go into their apartment, to their homes, because the National Guard had been there and they were locking down everything. Okay, guys, we're going to hear from my friends from Back to the Basics 101. Back to the Basics 101 is a small business owned by Johnny and Ginger Butts. They are a farming family who are also believers. Basics, in their name, Back to the Basics 101, is an acronym for Brothers and Sisters in Christ Service. Ginger believes that when we're saved, discipled, and healthy, we can enjoy the abundant life Jesus talks about in John 10:10. Their family has experienced healing from what Ginger calls modern diseases through God's creation. Back to the Basics 101 produces 4 product lines to help consumers get nutrition from the source. Each of their product lines get you as close to the point of nutrition as possible. For instance, their homemade baking mixes are made from the wheat they grow in Middle Georgia. Ginger then takes the wheat to a miller who raises the gate to his pond, which activates the 4-foot stone mill that grinds the wheat berries into flour. She keeps the process primitive to ensure the consumer gets nutrients at their peak. Their other 3 product lines include a plant protein blend, elderberries and more ultimate syrup kit, and seasonings. I just want to say that every time I feel a cold coming on, I use Ginger's elderberry syrup kit, and it is so good. My mom always keeps it in the fridge, and if we ever feel a cold coming on, we will take the elderberry syrup. So good for you. Highly recommend. So go to backtothebasics101.com and use code CCW10 for 10% off your first order. Again, that's backtothebasics101.com, code CCW10 for 10% off your first order. Follow them on Instagram and Facebook to see all their small batch products to help make a healthier you. On top of this, the residence was used to house the National Guard, and they did not consent to this. And they also had property missing, and their rooms had been ransacked. So with all of this said, how did the court rule on this matter? I mean, after all, doesn't it clearly seem like a violation of the Third Amendment? Before I let you know how the court ruled, which I kind of did talk about this earlier, I want you to think about the situation and how you think the court should have ruled. So think about it for a second. The National Guard was called in by the governor of New York. because these employees were on strike, and they called the National Guard in and they got it under control. They kicked the jail corrections officers out of their homes, which they lived on site. Remember, they're tenants. They're not owners. They're just renting the place. Like, it was kind of like renting. And they kicked them out and basically said, you can't stay here. We're taking over. We're locking everything down. And then on top of that, the National Guardsmen were allowed to stay in these people's homes. How do you think the court should have ruled on this? Well, there's a lot that goes into this. But to make it short and sweet, they ruled in favor of the governor of New York. But I want to kind of explain in more detail the ruling. So I want to reread the Third Amendment. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by the law. According to Wikipedia.com, it says, in a 2-1 decision by a 3-judge panel, Engblom articulated 3 principles that apply to the challenges under the Third Amendment. First, National Guardsmen are considered soldiers for the purpose of a Third Amendment claim. This holding extends the Third Amendment protections beyond federal armed forces such as the Army to include state-regulated militia. Second, the Third Amendment is incorporated and thus applies to individual states as well as the federal government. This holding extends the Third Amendment protections beyond federal use of the National Guard to include state use of the National Guard. Third, the protections of the Third Amendment apply beyond fee simple home ownership. The holding interprets the Third Amendment as protecting those who have general control over their access to a property. The panel determined that the correctional officers were tenants having such great control and remanded the case back to the district court. However, the lower court ultimately ruled in the defendant's favor based on qualified immunity. So we're going to break all of that down because, like I said, the simple terms is they ruled in favor of the governor of New York, but what does all of that mean? So just to recap, the ultimate decision was in favor of the defendant, the New York governor, and the various state prison officials who were also involved. The Supreme Court used a 3-part test to see if the Third Amendment right of the correctional officers was violated. So this court case was filed, and it went to the state court. Well, they sent it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said this is how we would rule. We would rule in favor of the corrections officers, but we're going to send it back to the district court because we don't want to deal with this. So when the Supreme Court was deciding to rule, they did a 3-part test to determine how they would rule. The Supreme Court used a 3-part test to see if the Third Amendment right of the correctional officers was violated. The court said that the National Guard were soldiers. Secondly, the court decided that the Third Amendment was incorporated, meaning that it applies to states and their actions. In addition to this, they decided that the corrections officers met the requirement of general control in their property. The court, in its final decision, decided that there seemed to be a violation of the Third Amendment. So remember, the Supreme Court did see a violation of the Third Amendment. However, they sent it back to the district court of the state. However, the court decided that it would be better to remand the case back to the district court. Remand basically just means to be sent back. The district court then decided that there was a violation of the Third Amendment rights of the corrections officers. However, the district court ended up deciding in favor of the defendants, which is the governor of New York and the various state prison officials who were involved in calling the National Guard. They ruled in this way because of qualified immunity. Okay, what in the world is qualified immunity? Qualified immunity is a type of legal immunity that protects a government official from lawsuits alleging that the official violated the plaintiff's rights. Only allowing suits where officials violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right. Qualified immunity balances 2 important interests: the need to hold public officials accountable when they exercise power irresponsibly, and the need to shield officials from harassment, distraction, and liability when they perform their duties reasonably. That is from Law Cornell EDU, the definition of qualified immunity. The district court ruled in favor of the defendants because of qualified immunity. The court ruled this way because of lack of precedents of Third Amendment cases, and the standard of violating constitutional rights knowingly was not met. So essentially they ruled this way because there really wasn't many cases. Actually, there aren't any cases that deal with the Third Amendment except this one. And so they said, well, because of this, we'll just, rule in favor of the defendants because of qualified immunity. In my honest opinion, y'all, this is not okay. This was clearly a violation of their rights. And I'm glad they stood up for themselves, but the court was wrong, I feel like, in their ruling. And I do feel like the Supreme Court should not have sent this back to the district courts. I think the Supreme Court should have ruled on this. I can't believe this actually happened. Like, this is crazy. I just want y'all to think about that. While this amendment seems to be one that's forgotten, it is one that came up. This court case happened, y'all. This court case happened in 1979. So it hasn't been that long ago. And this could very easily happen again. And if we are not careful, the government will infringe on our rights yet again. Y'all, we have to know this stuff. We have to. It's so important. I think it's crazy that the district court ruled in favor of the defendant. I want to know what y'all think, though. Please comment below. Do you feel that it was a violation of Americans' rights? Or do you feel that the governor of New York had every right to call in the National Guard and basically allow them to prevent people from going into their homes on the property of this prison and to also take over their homes? How do you feel about that? The Third Amendment might not be the most talked about today, but that doesn't make it any less important. The founders included it for a reason: to protect our rights and freedoms, just like every amendment in the Bill of Rights. That is why I encourage you to commit these amendments to memory. Every time I give you a new amendment, I really want you to remember it. That's why I always repeat them every episode so you continue to hear it and talk about it. I really want y'all to memorize them because it is so beneficial. They are not just words on paper. They are the foundation of our liberty. Okay, y'all, let me tell you about my friends at Conviction Co. Conviction Co. is a family-owned business started by a Midwest stay-at-home mom. Their goal is to provide their customers with high-quality and on-trend apparel and accessories that make it easy to boldly share truth and spark important conversations. I own 2 of their hats, and they are the best quality hats. I own the trucker hats. One says One Nation Under God, and the other one says Make America Healthy Again. I have my husband trying them on, my dad trying them on, my cousin trying them on, and my grandma actually bought some of the hats. So that just shows how they really speak to people. They catch people's attention, and it's a way for you to boldly share your faith, but make it fashionable. So go to convictioncode.com and use the code OfficialCCW to get 10% off your order. Again, that's convictioncode.com. Use code OfficialCCW to get 10% off your order today. I'm incredibly grateful for the foresight of the founders who carefully crafted these protections to ensure our freedoms would not be stripped away. My goal for this podcast is to help you navigate life with liberty, truth, and grace. But to do that, we have to be informed. Understanding these amendments isn't just history, it's power. Even in the court case I just mentioned, do you think the court ruled correctly? If not, why? I kind of talked about this already, but I want to know your thoughts. If you do think they ruled correctly, why? I already gave you my opinion. I feel that they were wrong. I feel like the court should not have ruled this way, and that the Supreme Court should have not sent it back to the district court. They should have taken the initiative and ruled on this so that people would know the precedent when it comes to the Third Amendment. Please comment your thoughts below because I really want to see different ideas and opinions. I want to know what y'all think. The residents of the manufacturing house stood up for what they believed in. Will we do the same if it comes to that? It is so important that we educate ourselves on these topics and discussions. I am telling you guys, the government will overstep and has many times. Like, we just saw it in 1979 in this court case. They overstepped and they won. We have to be knowledgeable of our rights so that we can protect them. I get really annoyed when people turn a blind eye to politics and American history. It's so important that we educate ourselves, y'all. It's so important. And you can't complain if you don't do anything about it. That's my go to. And so again, I just want to say we have to be knowledgeable of our rights so that we can protect them. Thank you all so much for listening to this podcast. I am getting more comfortable and getting more confident in the way that I podcast. And so I'm really grateful for that. For those of you who enjoy listening, if you want to just share this podcast episode with just one friend, send me the proof at voicesoflibertycontact@gmail.com and you can get a shout out on the podcast, but also get sent an exclusive CCW sticker. So this is just a way for me to expand the CCW community, expand the Voices of Liberty community, and get word out to more people so that more people can be educated on their rights as Americans. I really am a huge believer and we have to understand the politics of yesterday before we can begin to talk about the politics of today. And so before I really begin to just cover things going on in the news and whatnot, I really want to make sure we understand the basics. This is the framework for everything else. And it's so important that we understand it. Because if we don't understand this, we won't understand the rest. And it's so important that we understand that. So that's why I'm big on expanding the community, expanding the Voices of Liberty community. And I was going to do video for this podcast, but I was kind of busy this weekend and I need to research the video part a little bit more. I really want to add video eventually to these podcast episodes to kind of make it seem more personable. So I will plan on doing that eventually, but for right now, I'm just going to do audio. So it's a little bit easier for me to do. Right now, I'm literally just sitting on my bed creating this podcast episode. So I hope you all enjoy it. Please share it with just one friend. If you're interested in joining the Facebook groups, you can find it at Christian Conservative Wives. It's on Facebook. There's also one for Christian Conservative Women. Our website is christianconservativewomen.com. We have so much stuff available for you. If you're not on our email list, you better go and sign up because I'm about to start really pumping out some cool emails. So please, please, please ensure that you sign up for our email list if you're not already on there. I am, again, so grateful for every single one of you. And I really hope you enjoy this episode. It's not an amendment that most people know about, but it's so important. It has so much value. And we need to make sure we know every single one of these amendments. So that's why I'm big on it. I'm really encouraged by all the people who love the podcast. And I really hope that y'all continue to love it and share it. So if you want to do your own research on everything that I talked about, I linked all of my sources in the show notes, and I always do, just so you can go and do your own research and reading in your own free time if you're interested. So I highly recommend doing that because it's important to do your own research as well as listening to this podcast. Again, I'm so grateful for every single one of y'all. Thank you for listening.